They expected the Duke to dismiss her the moment she spoke out of turn. What no one expected was for him to stand before the War Council 3 days later and announce that the kitchen girl who had corrected his ambassador's translation would be the one to negotiate peace with the kingdom that had threatened their borders for a decade. And in that single, impossible decision, everything everyone believed about power, worth, and who deserved to be heard began to unravel. The morning it began, Elara Thorne had been kneading bread in the stone-walled kitchens of Greymon Hall, her hands dusted white with flour, her attention fixed entirely on the rhythm of work that had defined her existence for 3 years. She was 19, unremarkable in appearance, and possessed a single distinguishing feature that she had learned long ago to keep hidden. She understood 7 languages fluently, a gift inherited from a mother who had once been a translator before illness and poverty stripped everything away. Elara had taught herself to survive through invisibility. She never spoke unless addressed, never lifted her gaze beyond what duty required, never offered opinions or corrections, no matter how glaring the mistakes she overheard in passing. Until the day the Kale ambassador arrived. The delegation from Kale had come under tense circumstances. Border skirmishes had escalated. Trade routes had closed. Whispers of war threaded through every corridor of Greymon Hall, and Duke Matthias Aldrin, young for his title at 28, had summoned his entire council to hear the ambassador's terms. Elara had been sent to serve wine during the meeting, a task she performed with her usual quiet efficiency, pouring carefully, stepping back into the shadows along the wall where servants were meant to remain unseen. The ambassador spoke in Kalish, his tone formal, his words deliberate. The Duke's translator, an elderly man named Corwin, repeated each sentence in the common tongue with practiced precision. Everything proceeded smoothly until the 3rd clause of the proposed treaty. Corwin translated it as a demand for increased tariffs on grain exports. Reasonable enough, if unwelcome. But Elara's hands tightened on the wine pitcher because that was not what the ambassador had said. Not even close. He had proposed a mutual reduction in tariffs to encourage trade recovery. The exact opposite. She stood frozen against the wall, heart pounding, as the Duke's advisors erupted into immediate protest. Outrageous, one snapped. They seek to bleed us dry while their forces mass at our borders. The Duke's expression darkened. His jaw tightened. And Elara watched in mounting horror as the entire negotiation began spiraling toward conflict based on a translation that was fundamentally, dangerously wrong. She should have stayed silent. She knew that. Servants did not interrupt councils. Servants did not correct noblemen. Servants did not risk everything for the sake of truth. But the alternative was war. Her voice emerged quietly, but it carried. That is not what he said. Every head in the room turned toward her. The Duke's gaze found her instantly, cold and assessing. The advisors stared in open shock. And Corwin, the translator, paled as though she had just accused him of treason. The silence stretched unbearably. "Repeat that," the Duke said, his voice dangerously soft. Elara's throat tightened, but she forced herself to continue. "The ambassador proposed reducing tariffs, my lord, not increasing them." Master Corwin mistranslated. Corwin sputtered immediately. "Your Grace, this is absurd. A kitchen girl does not." "She speaks Kalish?" the Duke interrupted, his attention never leaving Elara. "I do, my lord." "Fluently?" "Yes." Another pause, heavier now, as the impossible nature of the claim settled across the room. One of the advisors laughed dismissively. "This is a waste of time. The girl seeks attention, nothing more." But the Duke raised one hand, silencing him instantly. Then he looked toward the Kale ambassador and spoke directly in Kalish. His accent rough but comprehensible. "Did you propose reducing tariffs or increasing them?" The ambassador blinked in surprise, then answered clearly. "Reducing, your grace. To restore trade trust between our kingdoms." The Duke's expression did not change, but something in the air shifted. "Pardoned." He turned slowly back toward Corwin. "Explain." The elderly translator stammered, his confidence crumbling. There must have been confusion in phrasing, your grace." The linguistic structure was clear, Elara said quietly. He used the term lessen, not increase. There is no ambiguity. Corwin's face flushed with anger and humiliation. "You forget your place, girl. And you," the Duke said icily, "have mistranslated a treaty that nearly led us into war." The room fell into stunned silence. The Duke stood slowly, his gaze sweeping across his counsel before returning to Elara. What else did he mistranslate? She hesitated, knowing this moment would define everything that followed. Then she stepped forward slightly and began listing, clause by clause, every error Corwin had made. By the time she finished, 3 advisors looked ill. The ambassador looked vindicated, and the Duke looked as though he were seeing her for the very first time. "What is your name?" he asked. "Elara Thorne, my lord." He studied her for a long moment, then turned toward his counsel. "We will reconvene in 3 days. And when we do, Miss Thorne will provide the translation." The explosion of protest was immediate and absolute. But the Duke silenced it with a single look, and Elara understood with growing certainty that she had just stepped into a world that would either destroy her or force everyone around her to see what they had spent years refusing to acknowledge. The 3 days that followed felt like standing on the edge of a cliff, waiting for someone to decide whether she would be pulled back to safety or pushed into the void. The kitchen staff treated Elara with a mixture of awe and suspicion, as though she had performed a magic trick they could not quite explain. The Duke's advisors, meanwhile, made no effort to hide their contempt. She was summoned to the Duke's study the evening before the reconvened council. The room was austere, lined with maps and correspondence, lit by the low glow of oil lamps that cast long shadows across the stone floor. Duke Matthias Aldrin stood near the window, his posture rigid, his hands clasped behind his back. He did not turn when she entered. "You put me in an impossible position," he said quietly. Elara remained near the door, uncertain whether to speak or wait. "My counsel believes I have lost my senses," he continued. "They argue that allowing a kitchen girl to negotiate on behalf of Greymont is a humiliation we cannot survive." Her chest tightened. "Then do not allow it, my lord. I spoke only because you were right." He turned then, his gaze sharp and unreadable. "And because remaining silent would have cost lives." She said nothing. He stepped closer, studying her with the intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle that should not exist. "How does a kitchen girl learn 7 languages? My mother was a translator before she fell ill. She taught me what she could before she died. And your father? Gone before I could remember him." The Duke's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "So you have spent your life unnoticed, despite possessing a skill most noblemen would pay fortunes to acquire." "Yes, my lord." He exhaled slowly. "If I allow you into that council room tomorrow, they will not forgive easily. Some will see it as weakness. Others will question every decision I make afterward. Then perhaps, but if I do not," he interrupted, "I will have chosen pride over peace. And I refuse to let men die because I feared what others might think of me." The certainty in his voice left no room for argument. "You will translate tomorrow," he said, "and you will do so without apology." "Yes, my lord." He hesitated, then added more quietly, "They will try to discredit you. Be prepared." She met his gaze steadily. "I have been discredited my entire life simply by existing where I was not expected. I am used to it." Something flickered in his expression, respect, perhaps, or recognition of a truth he had never needed to consider before. "Then let us see," he said softly, "what happens when refusal is no longer an option." The council chamber the next morning felt like a battlefield before the first strike. Every advisor sat stiffly in their seats, their expressions ranging from open hostility to cold skepticism. The Kale ambassador and his delegation occupied the opposite side of the table, their faces carefully neutral. And at the center of it all, Elara stood beside the Duke's chair, her hands folded neatly in front of her, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain everyone could hear it. The Duke opened the session with devastating simplicity. "We will proceed with accurate translation. Miss Thorne will provide it." One advisor, Lord Sidon, leaned forward immediately. "Your Grace, with respect, this is madness. We cannot entrust our kingdom's security to someone with no training, no credentials, no title." The Duke finished coldly. "Say what you mean, Cadden." The advisor's jaw tightened. "She isn't proven. She proved herself 3 days ago when she prevented a war based on incompetence." Another advisor, Lady Orlin, spoke with icy precision. "And if she mistranslates deliberately? If she has been paid by Kale to mislead us?" Elara's stomach dropped, but the Duke's response was immediate. "Then I will hold myself responsible for trusting her." But I will not hold this kingdom hostage to fear of competence simply because it arrives unexpectedly." The room fell silent. The Kale ambassador cleared his throat and spoke in Kalish, his tone cautious but curious. "Perhaps the young woman could demonstrate her skill before we proceed?" Elara translated his words smoothly into the common tongue. The ambassador continued, this time shifting into a northern Kalish dialect known for its complexity. "I mean no offense, but precision in language determines whether we build peace or stumble into conflict." Again, Elara translated flawlessly, including the subtle shift in dialect. The ambassador smiled faintly and switched languages entirely, moving into Rivik, a neighboring kingdom's tongue rarely spoken outside its borders. "If she understands this, then I will trust her fully." Elara did not hesitate. He said, "If I understand Rivik, he will trust me fully." A murmur rippled through the Kale delegation, followed by visible approval. Lord Cadden looked as though he had swallowed something bitter. The Duke's expression remained unreadable, but his voice carried quiet satisfaction. "Shall we begin?" What followed was the most intricate negotiation Greymont had seen in a generation. The Kale ambassador laid out terms carefully, and Elara translated each one with precision that left no room for misunderstanding. But halfway through, the ambassador made a proposal that shifted everything. He suggested a cultural exchange, scholars, artisans, seasonal festivals, to rebuild trust gradually before committing to full alliance. It was brilliant. It was unexpected, and Lord Cadden immediately tried to reject it. "We cannot allow Kale citizens free movement through Greymont," he argued. "The security risk," Elara interrupted quietly. He did not propose free movement. He proposed supervised exchanges in neutral locations. Cadden glared at her. "I do not require your commentary, girl. Only translation." "Then translate accurately what I propose," Elara said, her voice steady despite the danger. "Because rejecting an offer he did not make will end this negotiation before it begins." The room went deathly still. The Duke turned slowly toward Cadden. "She is correct. You overstepped." Cadden's face flushed with anger, but he said nothing. The negotiation continued, and with each passing hour, Elara's translations became not just accurate but essential, clarifying nuances that prevented a dozen potential misunderstandings. By the time the session ended, the Kale ambassador stood and addressed the Duke directly in the common tongue, his accent thick but sincere. "Your translator has done more for peace today than 100 soldiers ever could." The Duke inclined his head. "She is not my translator. She is Greymont's." And when his gaze found Elara's across the table, she saw something that terrified and steadied her in equal measure: belief. The treaty was signed 4 weeks later in the Great Hall of Greymont, witnessed by dignitaries from 6 kingdoms and celebrated with cautious optimism by a population that had lived too long under the shadow of war. Elara stood near the back of the hall during the ceremony, dressed now in simple but proper attire befitting her new role as the Duke's official diplomatic translator, a position created specifically for her and one that had sent shockwaves through the entire aristocracy. But the ceremony itself was not the hardest part. The hardest part came after, when the world had to decide what to do with a kitchen girl who had proven herself indispensable. Some adapted quickly. The Kale ambassador requested her presence at every subsequent meeting. Neighboring kingdoms began sending inquiries, asking if Greymont's translator might be available for hire. Merchants who had once ignored her now bowed respectfully when she passed. Others refused entirely. Lord Cadden resigned from the council rather than serve alongside her. Lady Orlin remained coldly polite, but never missed an opportunity to remind others of Elara's origins. And the whispers, those never stopped. "She's overstepping. She's ambitious. She's using the Duke's favor." Elara heard all of it and learned to carry it the way she had always carried things that were unfair, quietly, without complaint, and with the knowledge that her work would speak louder than any defense she could offer. But the Duke noticed. One evening, weeks after the treaty signing, he summoned her to the estate's library, a room she had only ever cleaned, never inhabited. He stood near the fire, a glass of wine in hand, his expression thoughtful. "You have not asked for anything," he said without preamble. Elara blinked, confused. "My lord, a title, land, wealth. You negotiated peace, yet you live in the same small room you occupied as a kitchen worker. I have what I need." He studied her carefully. Most people in your position would demand recognition. Recognition was never why I spoke. Then why did you? She considered that, then answered honestly. Because silence felt like complicity, and I could not live with that. The Duke set his glass down and turned to face her fully. The council still questions your presence. Some believe I have shown favoritism beyond reason. Perhaps they are right. They are not. His voice sharpened. You earned your place by being correct when everyone else was wrong. That is not favoritism. That is competence. Elara said nothing, but something in her chest loosened slightly. I am making your position permanent, he continued. You will negotiate on Greymont's behalf in all diplomatic matters requiring translation. You will be paid accordingly, and you will be addressed with the respect your skill commands. My lord, that will only deepen their resentment. Let it. He stepped closer, his gaze unwavering. I spent years governing based on what others expected of me. I chose advisors because of their titles. I trusted translators because of their credentials. And I nearly led us in a war because I valued appearance over truth. He paused, then added more quietly. You taught me that worth is not determined by where someone begins. It is determined by what they do when given the chance. Elara's throat tightened with unexpected emotion. I will not apologize for recognizing that, he said firmly. And neither should you. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The fire crackled softly. Rain began tapping against the tall windows. Thank you, my lord, she said finally. He nodded once, then smiled faintly. Besides, the Kale ambassador specifically requested you handle the next negotiation. Apparently, you are the only translator he trusts not to start a war. Despite herself, Elara laughed quietly. The Duke's smile widened briefly before his expression grew serious again. This will not be easy. The resistance will continue. I know, and you are prepared for that. She thought of her mother, who had translated in shadows her entire life. She thought of every moment she had bitten her tongue to survive. And she thought of the young Duke who had chosen truth over tradition when it mattered most. Yes, she said, I am. Years later, when historians wrote about the Greymont-Kale alliance, they would speak of the unlikely kitchen girl who had prevented war with nothing but her voice and her refusal to remain silent. Some would romanticize it. Others would criticize it. But those who had been there, the Duke, the advisors who eventually learned to respect her, the Kale ambassador who became a lifelong ally, they knew the truth. Elara Thorne had not changed the world because she sought power. She had changed it because she understood something most people spent lifetimes avoiding. That courage was not the absence of fear, but the refusal to let fear choose silence over what was right. And in the end, that had been enough. The Duke made her his chief diplomatic advisor within 2 years. She negotiated treaties with 4 kingdoms, prevented 2 conflicts, and trained a new generation of translators who understood that language was not just words, but the fragile bridge between peace and war. And though she never sought titles or land, she was given both eventually, not as gifts, but as recognition that some contributions could not be measured by birthright alone. She remained at Greymont for the rest of her life. And when she finally retired decades later, the Duke, now an old man himself, stood before the council and said simply, "She was the best decision I ever made." No one argued, because by then, even the most resistant among them had learned what the Duke had understood that first impossible day, that sometimes, the person who saves you is not the one you expected. Sometimes, it is the one you almost missed entirely.